Without further ado, I'd like to introduce tonight's speaker. Tonight's speaker is Mauricio Tenorio-Trillo. He is the Samuel N. Harper Professor of History at the University of Chicago and Professor, Asociado at Centro de Investigación y Denuncia Económica, or CIDE. I got a nod. I said it right. CIDE in Mexico City. His latest books are Silo's Law on History and Language, published in 2019, and Latin America, The Allure and Power of an Idea, published in 2018. He holds a PhD from Stanford University. Please, everyone, help me in welcoming Mauricio. Mauricio, come on up.
Can you hear me? Yes. Okay, what I'm going to talk to you about is what I was asked to talk to you about Benito Juarez. And as you might hear his name, because he's often considered the sort of Mexican Lincoln. Moreover, often in many murals and paintings and encounters between Mexican and American presidents, both images are put together as if they were the same, and they meant the same for their respective histories. Benito Juarez is, to put it plainly, was a president of Mexico, very important in Mexican history, but what I want to show you today is a little bit more than the common thing. As you know, we have a Juarez monument in the Magnificent Mile. Is there, and I think it's good. You know, it's good to have a Juarez monument in maybe the third or fourth city with the largest Mexican population in the world. That is, Chicago has more Mexicans than most of the cities of Mexico, except for Guadalajara, Monterrey, Tijuana, and Mexico City and Los Angeles. Chicago has more Mexicans than most of the cities. So it's good to have a Juarez monument. Now, Juarez is a complicated character. I want to start with 6 very opinionated statements for you to, I will try to use here, to understand, to start, to give you these very opinionated statements, and then try to unpack them and spell it out for you. What do I mean by this? And I want to challenge both American and Mexican views of Juarez in order not to, so to speak, badmouth the reputations of such an important hero, but for us to understand how complicated is history. History is never the fight of good versus evil. History is always ugly, and it's always bad. And but nevertheless, it is important, very important to understand it, and to understand why the good guys were good, but it's very complicated. So the first statement will be, who was Juarez? Well, Juarez was is known because he was a very controversial, first of all, governor of his home state of Oaxaca. By the way, Oaxaca is the state where these alebrijes come from. And Oaxaca, he was a governor of the state of Oaxaca. He was a very, very important liberal thinker, ideologue, and politician. And by liberal, I mean something very important, and as I will try to show you. It's not liberal in the sense that we understand now in the United States. This is liberal in the sense of the 19th century. Liberal, as I will try to show, meant basically a modernizer, a person who is in favor of individualistic views rather than corporatist views, a person who is in favor of the rule of law. All those ideas that you take for granted, whether a liberal, a Republican, or a Democrat, very, very much part of the 19th century. So he was a very important liberal. And he was a very contested president from 1858 to 1872. So That is why he is very well known, and I will show you why was he very important in those years. But let me show you that from the late part of the 19th century, after he died, he has become he has occupied a central place in Mexico's pantheon of myths. So because he was considered a very good example of upper social mobility, because as the legend will say, as we all Mexicans were taught in our official history textbooks in Mexico, he was a humble Indian from Oaxaca who was able to become the president of Mexico. So if you want, this was the Mexican way of yes, we can. He was from very humble origins, became president, and he was an Indian from Oaxaca. So that was a very important thing why he's part of the Mexican pantheon. He was also the builder of very important Mexican liberal institutions, as I will show you. By liberal institutions, above all, I talk about the separation of church and state. He was also the very successful commander of the defense of Mexico against a French invasion in the middle of the 19th century that became a very important war and established what in Mexico City, what in Mexican history is known as the Second Empire. You will say, why Mexico has Second Empire? What was the first one? Well, Mexico's independence in 1821 was as an empire. Mexico became an independent nation as an empire, which was asking for a Bourbon king from Ferdinand VII, king of Spain. So send us one of your children or nephews or brothers or whatever, and we will establish such a crazy thing as a monarchy and become an independent empire. If that sounds odd and stupid to you, it happened. Mexico became empire for 2 years. And then it happened elsewhere in the Americas, in Brazil. Brazil became an empire and remained an empire until 1888. And so he was very successful as the commander-in-chief, as Lincoln was for the Union forces. Juarez was for the fight against the French, but with a caveat. It was not, and this is what I'm going to show you, it was not merely a war against foreign invaders. It was a war against foreign invaders allied to Mexican forces. That is more than a war of intervention, which it was a Mexican civil war. Now, as I will show. Now, in a way, Juarez was, in fact, all this, a humble man that became a president, very important part of his biography. Also, he was indeed the leader of this fight. But in order to understand his victory, one will have to understand a lot of other things and not only his heroism. And he also, he was all that. But also, in another way, he was not, as I will try to show you. Mexico is now ruled, as you might know, by Andrés Manuel López Obrador, whose regime believes to be the continuation of the Juárez Revolution. So today, Juarismo or Juárez is very hip. It's very, to be Juarista is sexy. So, but regardless of that, Juárez heroism in Mexican history has always been challenged from day one. He's a hero closer to, let's say, President Grant, which there are people who like him, there are people who don't like him. He's not closer to Washington, which is difficult to find people who don't like him. But Juárez is very contested. He has always been both the hero of Mexican history and the bad guy of Mexican history, as we will see for reasons that I will explain you. And yet Benito was more than Juarez in many ways. Why? And less than Juarez. On the one hand, he was not only a Mexican thing, a Mexican character. He was engaged and he was part of what I will call a very important global moment in the middle of the 19th century. So he was, for reasons which I will explain, Lincoln's ally, both in a moment in which Lincoln had not many allies in the Civil War, and in a moment in which the liberal faction of Mexico had not many allies because France and Austro-Hungary were sending troops to Mexico. So, and he was also a hero and became a hero of Mexican-American communities in the United States, especially in New Mexico, for reasons which I will explain. He was a hero of the Oaxaqueños. It's very important, his Oaxaqueño identity. He's very important for them. And he was also a very important Republican, he was very important for Republican revolts throughout the war. He was often quoted in France, in revolutions, in Spain, in revolutions, in Italy. He became a liberal character of the 19th century, as I will show to you. On the other hand, he was also a very Jacobin, anti-Catholic, anti-religious character. He was very liberal, and his anti-clericalism produced a lot of violence and revolutions in Mexico. His closing of churches, his dismantling of convents and monasteries, his persecution of priests caused a lot of problems in Mexico. And also, he was a very authoritarian and dogmatic character, as I will try to show you, which in a way didn't help to overcome almost 5 decades of instability in Mexico. Now, Juarez was not a natural hero, if such a thing exists, but he was made a hero, ironically, at the end of the 19th century, by the guy who was his officer during many years, very important officer, and then president of Mexico and dictator of Mexico for more than 30 years, Porfirio Diaz, as I will show you. And so it is ironic that Diaz is today one of the 5 main villains of Mexican history. The names of the other ones there. While Juarez, who was made a hero by Diaz, is now undisputably one of the saints of Mexican nationalism. And you have the other names of the other heroes there. I don't want to spend much time, but Hidalgo is the father of independence, Zapata is the great hero of the revolution, and Cárdenas is the Mexican president in the 1930s who nationalized the oil industry in Mexico. Now, here we go to the core of the thing. Juarez was born a campesino, a peasant, in an Indian town in Oaxaca, a Zapoteco speaking. His first language, his mother tongue, was Zapoteco, which is one of the indigenous languages in Oaxaca. He was an Indian. Seen from the perspective of Jewish history, the Indian identity will be all in defining here. How come he was an Indian? A pure Indian, a man who spoke as first language Zapoteco became a president. So the whole thing will be, oh, here is an Indian. Not so fast. He was an Indian, but more important was that he was poor and not a descendant of the Indian nobility of Mexico. Because you might think well, there were Indian nobility. Actually, the Spanish crown only established a new branch, a new noble house of the highest status for the Moctezumas, the descendants of the emperor of Mexico. So Indian nobility was respected for 3 centuries. So by the 1850s and the 1800s, you have Indian noble people. So wealthy Indians, leaders. He was not a wealthy Indian. He was a poor Indian. But he was also a cosmopolitan, a character as they come. He, because of his difficult times he had to live and his difficult life, he was a lawyer. He was a Mason, very important in Mason in Mexican, Argentine, or French history. Masons were in the 19th century the centers of diffusion of great modern ideas, Republican and liberals. And so to belong to one Mason lodge was to belong to the modern cells of modern thought and modern political ideas. And above all, he was the embodiment of the adjective liberal in the 19th century, as I will try to show you. Now let's zoom in on all these opinionated opinions. First, Benito Juarez was born not in Mexico. He was born in New Spain, before Mexico was independent. So he was born according to the laws of the Spanish crown in an Indian town. And he was born in Antequera, what was then called Antequera, which is Oaxaca. This is very important. Oaxaca, the center of Oaxaca, Zapoteco. Now, another important aspect of his life is he started because of the help of a local priest. He was admitted and went through the seminary to become a Catholic priest. This is very important. Of course, he later left the seminary and didn't like religion, but the important thing is that there he learned it, and he became literate, and he then became a study in the famous Instituto de Ciencias y Artes of Oaxaca, which was a very important center of liberal ideas and liberal thought. There he had a very famous teacher, who taught him liberal ideas and all the new revolutions that were happening in the world, the United States, the Republican revolutions, the French Revolution. So he was enlightened, and then he became a member of a Mason lodge. This is what made Juarez. Now, it is important to understand that it is indeed very important that he was an Indian. But through all these things, and this is hard to understand, I know, in the United States, being an Indian is not that important. The important thing, as I will try to show you, is this is Benito Juarez. And you know, when he was alive, daguerreotypes were already possible. So here you have a daguerreotype with his wife. Now, this is very important. This is Oaxaca, the state he was governor of. But he was more a Oaxaqueño from the center, and during his governorship and during his regime has a lot of problems with the people of the Isthmus, of the Green Part, and was always fighting with them. Because Oaxaca is very complicated. Yes, he was an Indian and Zapoteco, but there are many Indians and another speaking another language. And he was not very in good relation with the people from Tehuantepec and this region, which was very important in the long run. He will be debating with the United States when he became a president to grant rights for the United States to construct a railroad in Tehuantepec, because before the invention of the Panama Canal, this was an option to create a railroad that will cross the isthmus all the way to the Mexican Gulf. Now, let's talk about the Indian issue. Identity is not what it used to be, as you know. We now debate identity, and we think that identity is a fixed thing that is always like that, and an Indian is an Indian, an African American is an African American. No, it always changes. In the case of Mexico, class, language, location, education, it's as important as being an Indian. Why? While all Indians have rights and opportunities in Mexico as Juarez, no, it was difficult. It was full of racism. People cannot move on. But once you, for any reasons, like a priest who sends you to the seminary, achieve certain education, become a lawyer, starts to play politics and starts to be successful, then it doesn't matter you are an Indian. So In Mexico, identity was the complicated and harsh business of estar. I want you to understand this. In the Spanish language, the verb to be is two verbs, estar and ser. You stay always temporarily. You are, eres, something. I'm a Mexican. Soy mexicano. I'm here. Estoy aquí. I will not remain here. Identity is something that you prove and are every single moment. Whatever you manage to prove, whatever you achieve in money, in all sources, is what you are. So the fact that you are a lawyer, the fact that Benito Juarez spoke 4 languages, Zapoteco, Spanish, Latin as an ex-seminary, and French, made him something different. So Juarez was a politician, was a caudillo, a sort of warlord of Oaxaca, a military leader, a lawyer, and a war strategist because he had to be. Then the Indian issue is less important. Now, not because there is no racism in Mexico or in the US, but we cannot assume that Mexicans were as equally racist, not in quantity, but in form, as the US, or that it never changed. It's the same. No, it's not the same. It's not that Mexico in the 19th century was not racist. It's not that Juarez was the first governor of Oaxaca who was an indigenous. It's not the case that Porfirio Diaz was also of mixed race Indian or white, whatever you want to consider. So it's not extraordinary. It's not that it's common, but it's important to understand that the Indian question, it was not the most important question in his life. Though for us today, to have an Indian president will be the first thing. Now, because for our 21st century conception of identity, Juarez will be a bad Indian, and I will show you why. A terrible Indian. Because he was, as many have argued, a betrayer of his race. He didn't fight for the land of the Indians. To the contrary, he was in favor of the laws, of the reforms laws that he fought for and applied in order to create a society of small landowners, a society of individuals and not corporation. Remember, Indians through the colonial times and through the first part of the 19th century were corporations. Whatever they did, fight for land, live in the towns or live in the barrios of Mexico City, they have legally the status of corporations whose land was owned communally as convents. So Diaz changed the law and say all land has to be individual. It will be like here to say that all the land owned by the church, owned by corporations, has to be put into the market in order to create a liberal economic market. And the Indians were the owners of communal land. And the laws that Juarez fought for attacked the lands of the Indians. On the other hand, could he have spoken our identity language of today and be very proud of being an Indian, speaking Zapoteco to the public? He could. But it was not a question. It was not an issue. Why? We cannot understand them, but you have to understand it at the time. For him, the important thing was to make of Indians citizens, individuals, according to the rule of law, equal to everybody. Now, the liberalism is very important for him. The rule of, what is liberalism in the 19th century? The rule of law. Universalism, not, the former Spanish laws were very baroque. There were too many exceptions, and everybody had their own codes and legal things, and that was okay. Now was the idea of create the rule of law equal to everybody. We are all citizens. The Mexican Constitution that he fought for in 1857 didn't establish the idea of Indians. Indians were erased because Indians are Mexicans, and that's it. And Spaniards are Mexicans, and mestizos are Mexicans. No race category. We are all Mexicans. The slavery was abolished after independence, and there was no distinction by race. We all have to create a liberal citizenship in which we are all equal. That was liberalism. So you think at the time, even for the United States, it was very radical. So regardless of your color, legally you were equal, which in a way went against the rights and the lands of the Indians because of colonial laws. But at the same time, was meant to create of Indians citizens, Mexicans. All education had to be done in Spanish. Now, he created the balance of power in a liberal way, as in the American Constitution, among the different branches of power, the legislative, the judiciary, and was very much constitutionalism. Create the codes and the state creation, the nation building, through the very famous reform laws for which he fought. A civil war that started in the middle of the 1850s in Mexico to establish the laws that separated the church and the state. To give you an example how lasting has been this legacy, I discovered in the Uber that I have a $20 pesos bill in my pocket. And I realized that Benito Juarez is here with the code of the reform laws, which is the creation of liberal institutions, separation of state and church. Now the state is going to be in charge of all the activities of the church, starting with education. You don't have to marry in the church. You don't have to be buried according to the church. You don't have to be baptized according to the church. You do it according to the state. But to show you how lasting is this, nobody has bills anymore in the United States. But if you were to have a $1 bill in your hand, you will realize that the bill says, "In God we trust." This is what Juarez did. No God. There is no God. The state is a lay, secular institution, no God. There is no official religion of the state. There is freedom of religion, but religious groups and people cannot publicly exercise. They have to do it privately. And the state and the church are completely separated. And that was a terrible war, because there were a lot of people in Mexico who thought that the only real thing that unified Mexico after 60 years or 40 years of wars after independence was religion, the Catholic religion. And didn't want freedom of religion, didn't want a state that is not declared a Catholic state, didn't want changes of the laws which are appropriated the land and the convents and the haciendas of the church, because the church was not only the church was the main bank in Mexico. So if you want to have the sovereignty of the state, you cannot have a state within the state. So separation, and that separation is lasting in Mexico until very recently. No Mexican president will talk about God. That doesn't mean that they were religious or not. That didn't matter. You don't talk about God. The first time that the sort of custom was broken was when President Fox in the 2000s received the Pope in Mexico and kissed the ring of the Pope. That was a scandal. A Mexican president should not do that. Should receive the Pope as a chief of a state of the Vatican, but not as a religious chief. Now, today, our Juarista president is very religious, a contradiction, an irony, and he's talking about God all the time. But that's something very recent. But formally, you don't talk about God. That's the separation of the state. You know, what was the target of all this law? Baroque traditionalism, all these laws that were created over the colonial times, all this privilege for nobility, or for Indian towns, or for the church, or for the military, all equal before the law. Catholicism was a main target, the church. Parcialidades and repúblicas de indios. Those were the legal names of the way Indians were organized in Mexico. And those were corporations, like a convent. And they have to be individualized, creating two municipalities and everyone to become a citizen. Now, neither Mexico nor Juarez were isolated ever. Mexico and Juarez were very much part of the war, as I will show. And there was the attraction of the American model. Juarez was often attacked for those who don't believe that he was a great hero because of his special relation with the US. Not only because he was the ally of Lincoln, but because he signed agreements with the US in order to allow the US to have Mexican free pass in Mexican territory, or the Tehuantepec agreements. So he was always making pacts. So he's, for some conservative Mexicans, Juarez is a betrayer because he was always signing pacts with the Americans. And the Americans, remember, 1848, Americans fought a war with Mexico, and Mexico lost half of the territory. How come a liberal president is becoming such a good friend of the Americans? And the constitutionalism of Juarez, of course, was inspiring American constitutionalism. And so he was always part of the war. Or there was the Brazil example. Brazil was a very stable country with an emperor. And this is very important to understand these very important moments when Juarez became a hero. Think of 1848, the end of the Mexican-American War, the loss of territory, of half of the territory for Mexico, and liberal revolution throughout Europe that is finally defeated, but people were scared everywhere, in Germany, in Austria, in England. And the question was, after the Mexican-American War, with such a mess in which Mexico lost a terrible war, was Mexico going to be like Poland? That is, never going to allow to be a country because either one power or another will take it. The Americans took it, now the Americans are gone, well, the French are going to come. So it's going to be like Poland. Then you have a massive Mexican civil war for these laws, for this constitutional against conservatives and liberals. And in the middle of this war, you have another problem. Not another 1848. There is not another war of invasion like the US, a foreign country that comes to Mexico with troops and conquers Mexico all the way to Mexico City. No, this is different. This is a Mexican civil war that all of a sudden becomes an international war. Because part of the Mexicans, which are as Mexicans as Juarez, many of them also indigenous, many of them also indigenous liberals, but indigenous generals, but conservative, Catholic, who had the idea in this moment in which France is becoming the first, let me show you. France is becoming very important. There is, after many things that I cannot explain, there is a new Napoleon, Napoleon III in France, which is conquering and becoming the hegemon in Europe. And he's willing to have 30,000 troops sent to Mexico to support a king in Austria, an Austrian prince, who wants, because the Mexicans are looking for an European monarch to come and rule Mexico. This is not extraordinary. Remember, if you remember your American Revolution, there were many royalists in the American Revolution. There were many who were, yes, let's break from England, but with a king. Why a king? Because it's the only form of state people knows. And you know, you have the example of Brazil. Brazil was from independence in 1822 to 1888, when the empire collapsed with slavery, more stable than the rest of Latin America, and including the United States, which in this way doesn't look very different than Argentina or Mexico. It had to kill each other to the last in order to create a nation. Just what conservatives wanted to avoid. So let's bring a monarch because Dom Pedro in Brazil has rule and is stable. And so that was, but why? But Maximilian is not. It's called, the conservatives go there, the liberals are fighting a liberal war, they go, they get the support of Austria, they get the support of some Austrian and Belgian troops, and then they convince Maximilian. Maximilian is not a minor prince, or one of those that you see in the Hello journal, magazine. Is the brother of the emperor of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Franz Joseph, the brother, with rights of succession to the throne. Why was he willing to play this? Was he crazy? In a way, he was crazy. But also, because the crowns are a net of snakes. They are always fighting. There were too many problems in the Austrian. On the other, you have Napoleon III giving you 30,000 troops. You have the conservatives. So you say, oh, I'm going to Mexico. But he was not a minor king. He was as high as you can get. In the market of princes, this is as high as you can get. The wife was the granddaughter of Luis Felipe de Orleans, the king of France, and of Leopoldo, the king of the Belgians. So the wife was as high as they come. So they went to Mexico. Of course, at the end, we have to understand that with the context of the US Civil War, the context of Napoleon fighting, at the end, Maximilian lost the war, and this is very important. Maximilian, and the killing of Maximilian at the end of the war, became an example of what was Juarez for the war, for good and for bad. Once Maximilian was captured in Querétaro at the end of the war, all the crowns of Europe, including Dom Pedro in Brazil, begged for mercy. The real heroes, the real military, once the commander has broken his sword, has given it to you, you don't kill him. When Maximilian was tried in Querétaro, the example that the lawyer always said, the great nations like the United States didn't kill Robert E. Lee. He was defeated. He threw on his sword. End of the story. You don't kill a prince of that high. You don't kill your enemy. That's against the rules of law of war. All the crowns are saying, don't do it. President Johnson in the United States is saying, don't do it. He did it. He killed him. This is an example. Those against Juarez said, this is why. You shouldn't have done that. You enlarged the violence and instability of Mexico by doing that. And created lots of enemies just because of that. You have forgive him and just send him back. Nothing had happened. For those who consider Juarez a hero, say, that was the right thing to do. So that they don't do it again. So that no other power thinks that he can invade Mexico and become a king of Mexico. Now, but the cause became so important that you have the famous Manet paintings of Maximilian shot in Querétaro. You have famous operas. This is a put of a very important opera by Franz Werfel called Juarez und Maximilian in German. You have the invitation to this famous, you have operas by very famous people. This is another painting of the last moments of Maximilian by a very important French painter, Lawrence. So it was very well known. Actually, it was so well known, this idea, that, Juarez, his first name is Benito. Do you know another Benito? A very famous one. Benito Mussolini. Benito Mussolini was called Benito because, as I told you, Juarez was a hero for all Republicans and anti-clericals in the world. And his father was a crazy Republican, anti-clerical, Mason Jacobin as Juarez, who happened to live in the Austrian parts of Italy. And so he named his son, who killed an Austrian Habsburg, Benito. And that's why Benito Juarez is, Benito Mussolini is called Benito. Now, the current president of Mexico, who is so Juarista, is very proud of. I don't know why you should be proud of the first name of Mussolini. Who cares about the first name of Mussolini? It's not that it's Gandhi, who is called Benito Gandhi. No, it's Mussolini. But so famous he was. This is the emperor. Now, this is the other character that is very important to understand, who was also a commander-in-chief in the wars, who was also the first friend of Juarez. This is Porfirio Diaz. So you can see it him, he was a commander-in-chief of Mexican army. He was actually very strategic. He commanded the final entrance in Mexico City at the end of the war. When the French were gone, when Maximilian was alone, and he was able to strategically pack with the French and everything in order to enter peacefully, allow the lawyers and doctors that wanted to help Maximilian against the orders of Juarez to go to Querétaro to defend him. So he was a pragmatist. And he became an enemy of Juarez and ruled Mexico for 30 years. At the end of his life, he looked like a commander-in-chief, like a French general. So here is an Indian. Here's what you can become. The Indian part doesn't matter. I don't say that is right or wrong. It was the way it was. The most important writer of the second part of the 19th century, Francisco Manuel Altamirano, was a Nahuatl speaking, who hated to speak Nahuatl and said that the only literature had to be in Spanish, and was an enemy of defending the Nahuatl languages and other native languages. You might think that he was wrong, but this is the way it was. Unless we're willing to tell them in the past what was the right way to do, you cannot tell these people how to consider their identity. What was important for him? That he was a Oaxaqueño from the Isthmus, enemy of Juarez, then friend, then enemy. And he was the one who made him a hero, who made Juarez a hero. That he was a successful commander, that he was a strategist, that he was also spoke Latin and French. He was also a former seminary and so spoke Latin. When he didn't have a job or he had no employment, he will teach Latin, and that he will make his living. Now, I want to jump to this, the cooking of a hero. So how was Porfirio Diaz made Juarez into a hero? And this is important because it's not that Juarez was naturally going to be, because he defeated the French. That seemed to be the right thing. But consider something. Napoleon III, Maximilian, Juarez, and the Mexican conservatives knew that everything depended in the war between conservatives and liberals, and Maximilian in the middle, on the American Civil War. If the Confederates were to win one game, if the Union were going to win another game. If the war lasts, good. If it doesn't last, the game is over in Mexico. And of course, it didn't last, as much as Maximilian wanted. The Confederates were in Mexico, are in France, trying to call Napoleon and Maximilian to make pacts. Never worked. Porfirio Diaz and Lincoln were always faithful. Lincoln couldn't help him much, though he established no sale of arms to Mexicans, but he always helped Juarez as much as he could, but he has his hands full. He was in a civil war. The moment it was over, then the French were scared to death, because Germany was growing in importance, the unification of Germany and the French-Prussian War of 1870s, of 1871. And so the moment the US was united and successful, the Union, then the whole exercise was over, because the Americans were not going to allow a foreign king in Mexico. The Monroe Doctrine, which Mexicans begged to apply. America for the Americans. Americans meaning the inhabitants of the Americas. No foreign power ought to help us. But of course the US couldn't do it. Once it was over, then the French ran away. And Maximilian decided to fight by himself. And then he was defeated by Juarez. So as you see, it was heroic, yes, but it was not that. He didn't have help from the Americans and help from this and that. Now, Porfirio Diaz make it into a hero because freedom was Hidalgo. Justice was Juarez. He created the judicial system, the legal laws, the system who called Mexico a liberal nation. And he was, Porfirio Diaz, peace. 30 years of peace and stability, the first ones in Mexican history. Now, the current, in post-revolutionary times, Juarez, after the 1920s, Juarez became, the same thing was established. Freedom, Hidalgo, independence, justice, Juarez. An institutionalized revolution, which was, let's call it the welfare state with a socialist thing, was the official pre-party. And now the new government says is freedom, justice, revolution, and I, López Obrador. That's what he calls himself, La 4T, La Cuarta Transformación, the fourth transformation. Now, and yet he has always been contested because he was a Jacobin, because he was anti-clerical, because he was a Mason, because he signed agreements with the United States that were not very favorable to Mexico, because he attacked indigenous lands, because he enforced lay education in Mexico, because of his lack of flexibility, remains a contested hero. I'm going to show you some image, and with that I will finish. So this is a book that was originally published in the 1930s, and this is about the great betrayals of Juarez, the United States, Spain, and this is a brand new book with the same topic to show you how contested he is. This is a picture of Lerdo de Tejada and Juarez, and they are showing a character which is, they call it this animal, the logofilio, logogrifo, and they are fighting for the presidency. They are just politicians fighting for the presidency. At the beginning of the 20th century, a very famous historian called that Juarez was a great courageous man, inflexible, and when countries, he said, are ruled by the brave men, they are a cemetery, a social cemetery. Countries ought to be ruled by the pragmatist, not by the brave men. And at the end, a communist historian say more or less the same. Juarez in his inflexibility, Juarez great heroism produced more violence. Some argue, some no. We ought to have Juarez because he had to be inflexible. No, Juarez, the problem with Juarez was that these are the monuments, the famous monument by Porfirio Diaz in Mexico to Juarez in La Alameda Central. This is the monument in Oaxaca to Juarez, and as you can see, the pedestal is done with the pre-Hispanic motifs. And this is our Juarez here in Chicago. Well, that is all. I'm going to show you some bibliography if you want. I was asked to give you some bibliography, so there you have it. Okay.
Awesome. Thank you.